Hi, this is Mortality with me, and I'm landing you first here on the mortality category of Actuarial News, one of my websites. I'm going to scroll down, and you see this graphic here. This graphic comes from an article from Vox, which I will pop up over here. If you just want to read the Vox article, just go to the video description right now. The link is right in there, as well as a link to the mortality category of Actuarial News. So let me start scrolling and just explaining what I'm going to do here. I'm going to explain some of the graphics that you see on this article, not all of them, and I'm going to make some critiques of the graphical choices they made. This is one of those endless scrolling, not endless scrolling, but scrolling articles where the visualizations are going to change and you see text go by, and yes, it's all very trendy. Okay, I mean, it was trendy 10 years ago, but you know what I mean. This is not very old person friendly, and I'm only 46, but I do have trouble seeing some of these. But let's just start out with this first graphic, which is a bubble map chart. And the concept here, this chart, by the way, the whole article is focused only on COVID deaths, official COVID or presumed COVID. Let's not argue those definitions right now. Let's just go with that because I want to point out some of the problems and what also we see with the graph. So one of the big problems here, and I'm going to see if I can scroll it back to the peak, and it just goes by so fast, and this is a problem. You see it animated big and then came down to the end of May 2020. It went by quite fast, so it's hard for you to see at this snapshot, end of May, you're like, oh, there's a lot around LA. Ignoring that there was this huge bubble centered on New York City, which of course is the one location which has had the most deaths in terms of a city. And it all happened in that first wave. There's so many issues with bubble charts in general, but especially a geographic one like this. Rather than get through everything, the obvious first aspect, the Washington, D.C. to Boston, and actually, I guess it's a part of New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire, schmear. You can't see any individual bubbles there. They're all rather big, and that's after that first wave had passed for the Northeast. I want to see if I can back up again. It's going to go by fast. I'm sorry, guys. Let me see if it's going to let me go back. Okay, let's see if it goes by again. Boom! And then it goes down. It's hard to see. How did you pick the scale? But the biggest issue with that, so with bubbles, they can overlap. They're doing the semi-transparent thing, so if they stack up over each other, then you can kind of see, but it doesn't really get darker in a way that you can see there's a very high density of deaths here. But here's the biggest thing. As Randall Munroe of XKCD fame has noted, a lot of these kinds of graphs simply show you where people live. There is high population density from DC to Boston. There is a reason, we call it the Acela corridor. Obviously, there's an Acela track there, and it gets a lot of volume, probably even now, I haven't checked. And one of the problems there is the reason it can actually be a useful train route as opposed to the dreams of California is there's a very high living density. You have so many more potential customers to go by train, and also it's a pain in the butt to take a plane just to be in the air for 30 minutes and then having to go through airport security and all that crap and all that time that takes up. In any case, we have a dark background, we have this magenta, this reddish color over it, and it's just really hard to tell. I'm going to scroll forward in time. Whoops, and it's bubbling, 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 and then it stops again. Okay, so here's another thing, and you can see this in Iowa and some of the other Midwestern states. You start to see that there's kind of a grid pattern to the dots, and a lot of those small dots are probably only a handful of deaths, because I believe, I don't know if they're doing daily deaths or if they're doing weekly deaths. Like one confirmed death. Okay, let me just scroll forward some more. Okay, so it's going to go more. Okay, and now we see the winter wave, and you can see it's really come into California. And then we've kind of got this, instead of, well, we still have a northeastern schmear, but what you can't tell is there's not a heck of a lot going on in New York City with regards to COVID deaths now. Isn't that interesting? But you can really see the grid of circles in many of these places. And then now to mid-January. And this third wave, and yes, there have been 3 waves of COVID deaths, is the deadliest in total number, but it's spread out over much more time in a much greater geography. And this may be indicating to us the seasonality of COVID going forward, similar to flu and pneumonia. So after all of that, we finally have title. The virus was unsparing, and this is true. This is focusing only on the U.S., but again, to give you some perspective here, the U.S. is the 3rd most populous country in the world. Obviously, China and India, both with over 1 billion people, have more people than the 330-ish, whatever we're up to now, million in the U.S., but it's still geographically a huge country, 3rd largest in landmass. Of course, Alaska helps a lot there, but we're also 3rd most populous. So when we look at what has happened in the U.S., a lot of similar patterns have happened in other countries, or I should say very large areas such as Europe. They're not showing Europe here, and maybe in a future one I'll go through The Economist's excess death tracker. And so again, I want to remind you, what we're looking at here, all the numbers we're looking at here are COVID deaths as reported by the CDC. And there's some issues there too, but we'll ignore that for right now. So the first slice that they want to do after we've looked at location and time with that bubble chart, bubble map chart, is the racial ethnic split out, share of deaths and share of population. Now, this is kind of interesting, but not really. And we will see why in a moment, because let's see what they said. Oh, in the small print, they said they did adjust for the differences in population among age groups, because if you actually look at percentage of of COVID deaths, pretty sure more than 42% of white, it was more than 42% of deaths were white people. The thing is, the white population in the U.S. is much older than all of the other racial and ethnic groups. And it's not just because of differences in mortality rates, but also differences in migration rates and fertility rates. So, yeah, this structure here, again, this is a huge country, 330 million people, over a very wide geographic area with different age distributions. Even if they said they adjusted for age distributions, they didn't adjust for everything else. And we're going to see in a moment, so let me scroll through here. They did it over months. So let's get that text off. I just want to see this graph by itself. So they did it March 2020 to December 2020 and did a breakout. And again, supposedly it's adjusted, it's age adjusted. I'm not sure how they're age adjusting it, because where COVID deaths occurred differed geographically, and those different states where they occurred have different age distributions. Did they age adjusted all to the same age distribution? Should they have? Well, anyway, let's start in March. In March, most of the deaths were, of course, centered around New York City, and the biggest spike was in New York City and New Jersey in terms of just sheer number. So, given that information, the racial and ethnic mix in that area, centered around New York City and New Jersey, would be the appropriate comparison, not the entire United States. But we see, and this is what's interesting, you can see how it's changed over time, and that's with waves. It's not because the racial dynamics of the disease per se differed. It can just be that the geographic spread differed, because you don't have the same, you may say across the whole, okay, let me just take the non-Hispanic Black population. That's 13% of the U.S. population for the whole country. However, if you go to Alaska, you will notice there are not a lot of black people there. Actually, similarly for California, except in certain cities. Most of California, it has a relatively high Asian and Hispanic population compared to the rest of the United States. Where you see very high concentrations of black population, of course, is in the Southeast. You're going to see very high proportions in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And of course, COVID deaths have occurred at different locations in the U.S. at different times of the year. So we have that Northeast spike, and, again, centered around urban areas, and that tends to be more black and Hispanic than the more suburban and rural areas in the states that got hit. And we see that in the pattern that hit New York. So we have March, and we see this white share keeps increasing. In May, and so they're not showing numbers, they're showing percentages. We had a lull in May and June in terms of COVID deaths, and then it started picking up at the end of July. We had peaks in August along the south of the U.S. Arizona was hard hit, but that doesn't have a high population. That's when a wave hit in Texas and Florida for the first time. And then this winter wave really hit hard in areas that had never been hit before, mainly the upper Midwest. But just Midwest in general started getting hit by COVID. So let's move on. And I'm just going to skip over that one. Because I don't think more white counties than less white counties. Again, these are not equally spaced out over the United States. The first surge in deaths in spring occurred mostly in places with a large share of non-white population, as I said, New York City, New Jersey. And then the winter surge brought more deaths to places where more white American lives. And then, as I said, the upper Midwest, which, if you ever visit there, you will notice Nebraska is pretty white. You'll notice South Dakota is pretty white. Yes, there is a Hispanic population everywhere, but specifically non-Hispanic black population has a very, very noticeable geographic pattern, and the areas where they are in, say, the Midwest and the North tend to be centered around specific cities like Chicago and Detroit, and not over the entire state. Okay, so now I'm just going to split over that because they're getting to, this is where I start to go, my face starts to melt. So they spent all that time on race and ethnicity, but the number one driver of disparities in death rates is age. And this is COVID, but this is for everything, almost everything, except for some very specific causes of death, like dying in childbirth, where you have to have a particular sex and be around a certain age range for that to occur. The share of deaths compared to the share of population is so inappropriate. Why even start there? You need to start, if you want to do share of deaths versus share of population for COVID deaths, compare it against the number of deaths in a regular year. You'll actually see that it's pretty similar, but not exactly the same. And I've shown that before, that there is a little overrepresentation in kind of that boomer range. So here we go. So then they compare the share of cases against the share of population, and that's a lot similar, other than kids. So we see, in the disparities here, they can say, oh, it's statistically significant that you have 15% of the cases for age 50 to 59, and 15% for those in my age range, 40 to 49, versus 13 and 12. But most people are going to look at that and say 2 percentage points or 3 percentage points does not seem like a huge amount there. But if you look at the under age 10, and just kids in general we're seeing here, they have an undershare of cases. So when I get to these next graphs share of cases as opposed to number of cases, share of cases to share of deaths, again, how much of this is really being driven by where this is occurring, because it's not all over the U.S. at the same time. In the summer, there was barely anything in the Northeast because we had a nice summer. People stayed outside. I would say what spurred that summer wave was a lot of people down south having a hot summer and staying inside and dealing with the AC, because this was August and September. Actually, the peak of like July and August were the peaks. Anyway, so I am not terribly impressed by the visualizations chosen here or any kind of analysis. Why they did this is the one comparison that I find just why would you do this? There should be a third column here showing the share of deaths by these age groups for 2019. And then you would see, there's really actually no difference in the share of COVID deaths, other than there is a little extra, I should say, there's the 70 to 79, and I think 60 to 69 for COVID is a little high compared to normal mortality. That said, that doesn't even inform you with regards to the impact of COVID, because this is percentage share. They keep comparing percentage share, and they don't compare absolute numbers. The only time they try to get to, that's all percentage share. The only time they got to the absolute numbers was in this map bubble chart, where it was hard to see the bubbles. Okay, I mean, what the heck, California? That bubble centered, I guess that's probably LA. And remember, I think this is county level mortality data. And if it is, then New York City was split up into 5 counties, because it's the 5 boroughs or 5 separate counties. Looking at this pattern, these bubbles look like these are all county level. And the Los Angeles County is the largest county in terms, it's huge geographically. It's not the largest county geographically, but it is the highest population county in the U.S. Having a bubble that big centered on LA, how much information is that really giving you? You're starting with counties that have base populations that differ to begin with, and then the original population density is really demonstrated here. If you do not know, east of the Mississippi, and I'm going to do this, and it's very easy because it lines up with state boundaries. So we start here, down here, New Orleans in that area, and then we come over, here we go, it's up here, this is the Mississippi River, boom, 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 boom. It doesn't go all the way up into Canada. But, this is the Mississippi River going along here, going by St. Louis and all of that. To the east of the Mississippi River, the settlement of the U.S. has been very dense compared to the West. People went all the way to the West Coast. And then as we got railroads and air conditioning, people filled in this area in the middle. But, especially the mountain regions, there's not much agriculture to do here other than cattle ranching. So there's not very many people living in Montana, North and South Dakota, Wyoming. In Colorado, people are concentrated in certain locations. Same for Utah and Nevada. There aren't people all across the states. They are bunched up along the coasts, and then there are clusters around major rivers in certain areas. So, these kind of maps can be very misleading if you don't know what the underlying population looks like. So nice first try, Vox. No, I know this is not your first try, but it would be helpful if there were some more in the visualizations. Maybe it's in the text, but in the visualizations themselves, that there were more appropriate comparisons being made. You're talking white, black, and this, that, and the other for counties. Let me just go down here. I'm sorry. Maybe you want to map what are the whitest and the least white counties. Just a thought. In the U.S., because there is a pattern there. And people will notice the pattern if you map it. Obviously, you guys know how to do map charts that are not based off of Microsoft, so that'll be your next assignment, Vox. See y'all.